The mayor walked past everyone, straight to the janitor with the mop. "Sir Dalton," he said, "you saved my life in Fallujah." The students froze. Phones rose. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The halls of Riverbend High echoed with youthful arrogance and unchecked entitlement. The tile floors, once gleaming under the morning light, were littered daily with candy wrappers, crumpled homework, and the careless wake of teenagers who had never been told no in any meaningful way. They laughed louder when they were being cruel, and they looked straight through the people who served them. Especially him. Frank Dalton moved quietly, like an old metronome, measured, consistent, and entirely ignorable. That was the role they assigned him. Just the janitor, a fixture, a mop in human form. His overalls, washed to a dull blue, bore a patch that read, "Frank," but no one looked closely enough to read it. His back slightly stooped, boots scuffing gently across the tile, he pushed his cart like it held the last pieces of his life. They called him trash. That single word hung in the air like a sneer, a label tossed from one student to another like a private joke that needed no explanation. Trash man, dumpster dude, mop grandpa. They got creative, emboldened by the silence that followed every insult. It wasn't that Frank couldn't hear them. He could hear every syllable, every laugh, every mocking imitation. But Frank believed silence had a weight that noise could never match. And so he let them talk. Each morning, without fail, someone kicked over the bins by the lockers, timed precisely as Frank turned the corner. Once, someone left a banana peel and dared him to slip on it. Another time, a group of juniors recorded themselves pretending to interview him, shoving a dirty broom toward his face as a microphone. He wiped up their spilled sodas and gum wrappers with the same care he gave to every corner of that school, never rushing, never slowing. Austin Pike was the worst of them. Tall, smug, and backed by the invisible shield of money, he didn't insult Frank for attention. He did it to reinforce his own reflection in the crowd. Mocking Frank was a group sport. It validated their place at the top of a petty hierarchy built on nothing more than image. One day, Austin caught Frank humming, a quiet, tuneless thread, barely audible over the hum of fluorescent lights. That was all the invitation Austin needed. "Hey, trash man," he called out, smug grin stretching across his face. "Still talking to yourself 'cause no one else will?" The hallway erupted with laughter. Lockers rattled with the echoes of it. Frank turned slowly. His eyes, tired but not dull, settled on Austin. Not with anger, not with fear, just quiet understanding. He gave a small smile, the kind that held more truth than words could carry. "You'll understand one day, son," he said, voice like worn leather. Then he turned, dipped his mop into the bucket, and returned to work, leaving Austin blinking, unsure why the moment suddenly felt heavier than the joke he thought he'd just nailed. They saw an old man pushing a mop. They didn't see the soldier inside him, worn but unbowed, fighting a different kind of war. Frank Dalton didn't need this job. The pension covered his bills. The VA checks arrived like clockwork. But when the world you love ends in twisted steel and a late-night phone call, routine becomes oxygen. And Riverbend High, with its sticky floors and teenage noise, gave him something close to breath. Once, Frank Dalton had led men through fire, his voice steady under mortar blasts. His uniform bore 3 commendations, one for valor, one for service, and one for a mission he'd never speak of again. The bronze star gleamed briefly at a funeral, then disappeared into a drawer. That life, the one with purpose, strategy, and adrenaline, ended not on a battlefield, but at a stoplight on Route 41, when a drunk driver ran the red and shattered everything. Frank's wife, Lydia, had been holding their son's hand in the back seat. There was no time to say goodbye. No medals to make it right. He spent a year in the bottle, another in the woods. Then, one morning, with nothing but his guilt and an old pair of boots, he walked into Riverbend High and asked if they were hiring. He told the principal he was good with quiet work. She didn't ask questions. He didn't offer answers. The school became his sanctuary, not because it was peaceful, but because it was alive. Every scuff on the lockers, every slam of a door, every locker room shout or slammed backpack was a drumbeat reminding him he was still among the breathing. Every shriek of laughter or fragment of a passing conversation carved a small window in the wall he'd built around his grief. And then he found Emily Tran. She was curled in the stairwell, her face red, sleeves pulled over her trembling hands. Her backpack was soaked, reeking faintly of disinfectant and humiliation. Frank didn't ask what happened. He already knew. He'd seen that kind of cruelty, how it spreads like oil on water, quiet and toxic. He knelt, took the bag, dried it as best he could, and reached into his cart. The bear was small, faded around the ears, and stitched twice where time had tried to tear it. His son used to call it Captain Soft. Frank held it out. "My son had one just like this," he said gently. Whenever life got loud, he held it tight. Emily didn't speak. She just took the bear, clutched it to her chest, and nodded once. She didn't know his name, but in that moment, she knew someone had seen her. Frank returned to his cart. He didn't look back, but he didn't have to. Something in the building shifted that day. Not loudly, not yet. But the silence? It felt just a little less empty. The gymnasium had never looked so polished. Bleachers gleamed under the overhead lights. Freshly waxed floors reflected the stage banners, and the scent of lemon cleaner still lingered faintly in the air. Students fidgeted in dress shirts and stiff shoes, whispering behind manicured programs. Teachers lined the walls, waiting for their cue. At center stage, a row of folding chairs awaited the school board, the superintendent, and the guest of honor, Mayor Clarence Ridley. Austin Pike strutted in the second row, tie loose around his neck, confidence radiating off him like heat. He elbowed a friend and nodded toward the front. "Dad's right there," he whispered, "next to the big chair. Probably going to be in the newspaper." The chatter dimmed as the doors opened. The mayor stepped inside, not in the suit and smile way they expected, but with purpose, as if looking for something. People stood. A wave of polite applause rippled across the gym. Cameras clicked. Principal Jenner approached, hand outstretched. But the mayor didn't stop. He brushed past her, past the superintendent, the school board, and the polished banners proclaiming excellence, integrity, pride. He moved toward the far corner of the gym, where an old man in navy overalls stood quietly beside a mop bucket. The room fell into a stunned silence as the mayor stopped directly in front of him. "Sir Dalton," he said, his voice carrying through the still air like a bell. "It's been far too long." Frank straightened, not defensively, but with the posture of a man reclaiming something he never asked to lose. The two men looked at each other, and for a second, it was as if the years peeled away. No bucket, no title, just two soldiers meeting on common ground. They shook hands. Not politely, not for show. It was the grip of men who had bled in the same dirt. "I owe my life to this man," the mayor said, turning slowly to face the stunned assembly. "In Fallujah, our unit was caught in an ambush. We were surrounded. I was hit. Panic was spreading. Frank Dalton, Master Sergeant Dalton, carried me 200 meters under fire. No cover. No hesitation. Gasps rippled through the rows. Phones rose. Faces pale. Austin sat frozen, color draining from his cheeks. In the third row, Emily Tran pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes already glassy with tears. Mayor Ridley placed a hand on Frank's shoulder, not as a politician, but as a man who'd once watched death coming and saw this janitor standing in its way. "And now," the mayor said quietly, "he's still serving. Here, in your school, cleaning up after you, watching over you. Humbling, isn't it?" Frank nodded. "Just trying to do some good," he said, voice steady as ever. But in that moment, the silence was no longer emptiness. It was reverence. The next morning, there was no ceremony, no cameras, no speeches. Just Frank, as always, unlocking the side door at 5:47 a.m., mop in hand, the chill of dawn brushing against his weathered skin. The hallways were quiet, but something felt different, like the first breath after a heavy storm. The silence didn't press on him anymore. It listened. By first bell, word had spread like wildfire, not just through whispered conversations, but in the stolen glances, the awkward silences, the sudden awareness that they'd all been walking past someone who had carried a dying man across a war zone and then chosen to sweep the floors of their school with the same calm hands. They had called him trash. Now they couldn't meet his eyes without blinking. A few tried to mumble apologies. Sarah Lynn, who once laughed when Frank dropped his keys, now waited to hold doors open for him. Miguel Jensen, who used to dump ketchup packets in the stairwell, quietly started stacking trays after lunch. Small gestures, stiff at first, clumsy, but honest. Emily Tran no longer sat alone in the library. She began meeting Frank in the art wing during break, sitting cross-legged beside his cart while he ate his sandwich and she sketched in silence. They talked about books, about her violin lessons, about how silence isn't always loneliness. "Sometimes," she said, "it's healing." Frank only nodded. She understood more than most. But it was Austin Pike who carried the heaviest weight. The swagger that once defined him had slipped. The jokes had dried up. He kept his distance for days, shadowed by his own shame, until one afternoon, as Frank was changing a bulb in the science wing, Austin approached alone. "I didn't know who you were," he said, his voice stripped of arrogance. Frank stepped down from the ladder, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked him in the eye. "Does it matter?" Austin hesitated, then dropped his gaze. "Yeah, it does. I was wrong." Frank held out a hand. "You've still got time to get it right." Austin shook it, firm, silent, the way men shake hands when words aren't enough. A few students passing by saw it. None of them laughed. From that day on, Frank became more than a janitor. He was a compass, quiet, steady, and unshakable. His presence carried weight, not because he asked for respect, but because he never needed to. The local paper ran a column. The school assembly honored him. But Frank never changed. He still swept the same corridors, still fixed the same leaky pipes, still whistled the same off-key tune. Only now, the kids stood a little taller when he passed. Some nodded, a few smiled. And every so often, one would greet him with reverence, voice soft but certain. "Good morning, Sir Dalton." And without fail, he'd tip his head and reply warm and steady. "Morning, kiddo. Make it a good one." And they did.